They strap you down at midnight. That's the rule. But Riley didn't care about the needle, or the chaplain muttering in the corner. She traded her last meal, her final appeals, everything, for 5 minutes with her K9. When they finally opened the door, what the dog did changed everything. Concrete has a taste. If you breathe it long enough, it coats the back of your throat like chalk dust, settling heavy on the tongue. Riley swallowed, tasting it. She sat on the edge of the steel cot, elbows resting on her knees, staring at the scuffed toes of her slip-on canvas shoes. The cell was exactly 8 feet by 10 feet. For the past 72 hours, the overhead fluorescent tube had hummed at a constant, maddening 60 hertz, flickering just enough to make the shadows in the corners pulse. It was 1,700 hours. 7 hours until the protocol started. Riley was the first female operator to earn the Trident, and tonight, she would be the first to receive a lethal injection at the United States Disciplinary Barracks. She rubbed her thumb against the side of her index finger, feeling the thick, ropey scar tissue there. A souvenir from a shrapnel burst in Helmand. She used to have rough, calloused hands, the hands of someone who pulled heavy gear, gripped coarse ropes, and racked charging handles. Now, after 18 months of confinement, her skin felt thin, sickly. Footsteps echoed down the corridor. Not the usual shuffle of the night guard, but the heavy, deliberate strikes of leather soles. Multiple pairs. Riley didn't look up. She kept her eyes on the floor. The heavy steel door clattered. The deadbolt slid back with a loud metallic clack that vibrated through the floorboards into her bare ankles. Inmate 4098. Step back. Face the wall. Hands visible. Riley exhaled through her nose. She stood, her joints popping in the damp chill of the cell, and turned her back to the door. She placed her hands flat against the painted cinder block. The paint was peeling in the shape of a jagged continent near her left wrist. She focused on that. The door swung open, sucking the stale air out of the room. "Turn around," Warden Miller said. Riley turned. Miller stood in the doorway, flanked by 2 guards in heavy tactical vests. Miller looked exactly like a man who spent his life managing cages. Gray skin, tired eyes, a uniform pressed so sharply it looked uncomfortable. Beside him stood the prison chaplain, clutching a small leather-bound Bible, looking anywhere but at Riley. "Your last meal request was declined," Miller said, his voice flat, devoid of malice or pity. "Just bureaucratic machinery. You asked for an MRE Menu 8, jalapeno beef patty. We don't stock military field rations in the civilian commissary." "I didn't want the food, Warden," Riley said. Her voice was raspy from disuse. "I wanted the smell." Miller blinked, processing the bizarre response, then dismissed it. "You made a secondary request. A visitation." Riley's heart gave a strange, painful kick against her ribs. She forced her face to remain utterly blank. "Yes." "It went up the chain," Miller said, looking down at a clipboard. The brass debated it. They don't usually permit non-human visitations on death row. But given your service record prior to the incident, the Pentagon authorized it. A PR concession, I imagine. Miller looked up, his pale eyes finally meeting hers. "He's here." The handler brought him. Riley stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. She clenched her jaw so hard her teeth ached. She had prepared herself for a no. She had spent the last 3 days convincing herself the military would deny the request out of sheer spite. They had stripped her of her rank, her freedom, and her narrative. She had pulled the trigger on a corrupt commanding officer to save a village full of civilians. But the dead man had a senator for an uncle. The court-martial was closed, classified, and swift. "Put your hands through the slot," the guard on the left ordered. Riley stepped forward and extended her wrists. The cold steel of the cuffs bit into her skin. The ratcheting sound was deafening in the small space. They shackled her ankles next, attaching a heavy belly chain that forced her to hunch slightly. "You have 10 minutes, Miller said. Standard visitation room. Plexiglass partition has been removed, per the Pentagon's waiver, but you remain restrained. Any sudden movements, any deviation from protocol, and the guards end the session." "Understood," Riley muttered. They marched her out of the cell block. The walk was agonizingly slow, dictated by the length of the chain between her ankles. Shh, clack, step. Shh, clack, step. The smell of the prison shifted as they moved from the maximum security block to the administrative wing. The sharp tang of ammonia and sweat gave way to the smell of fresh floor wax and stale coffee. Riley's stomach churned. She was a Tier 1 operator. She had jumped out of planes into hostile territory at 3 a.m. without her heart rate spiking above 90. But right now, her hands were shaking. She pressed her manacled wrists against her stomach to hide the tremor. They reached a solid oak door at the end of the hall. The guard swiped a key card. A green light flashed. "In you go," the guard said, pushing the door open. Riley stepped into the room. It was stark white, dominated by a bolted-down metal table and 2 steel chairs. But she didn't look at the furniture. She looked at the corner. He was sitting in a perfect heel position next to his handler. Havoc. He was a purebred German shepherd, pushing 85 pounds of dense muscle and coarse black and tan fur. He wore a faded olive-drab tactical harness with a muted American flag patch on the ribs. His ears were swiveled forward, tracking the sound of the door. "Havoc," Riley breathed. The word cracked in half on its way out. The dog's head snapped toward her. His dark, intelligent eyes locked onto her face. For a split second, he remained perfectly still, disciplined, waiting for the release command from his handler. The handler was Jensen, an old squad mate. He looked older, tired, lines carved deep around his mouth. He didn't say a word to Riley. He couldn't. The guards were watching, the cameras in the corners blinking with red recording lights. Jensen just looked at her, his eyes thick with unspoken grief, and then looked down at the dog. "Break," Jensen whispered. Havoc didn't run. He moved with a heavy, purposeful trot, his nails clicking sharply against the linoleum. He closed the distance in 3 seconds and pushed his massive head directly into Riley's stomach. Riley let out a sound she hadn't known she was capable of making. It wasn't a cry. It was a guttural, ugly sob that tore out of her throat. Her knees gave out. She didn't care about the guards. She didn't care about the cameras. She collapsed onto the linoleum, her heavy chains clattering loudly against the floor. Havoc whined, a high, anxious pitch. He pushed forward, forcing his body into the space between her arms, practically climbing into her lap. Riley wrapped her shackled hands awkwardly around his thick neck, burying her face in the coarse fur behind his ears. The physical impact of him was overwhelming. He was so warm, radiating a deep, living heat that cut straight through the chill of the prison. God, the smell! It hit her like a physical blow. Beneath the faint scent of whatever cheap dog shampoo the base kennel used, Havoc smelled like him. It was a complex, grounding scent. The musk of wet wool, dried earth, and the distinct, odd smell of his paw pads that always reminded her of corn chips. But deeper than that, buried in his undercoat, she thought she could still smell the dust of Kandahar. the sharp, metallic tang of the inside of a striker vehicle, the ozone of the desert night. "Good boy," she choked out, her face wet with tears and snot. She didn't try to wipe her face. She couldn't, not with the cuffs. She just pressed her forehead against his skull. "You're a good boy. Such a good boy." Havoc was licking her neck, her jaw, tasting the salt of her tears. But his movements were frantic. He paused, sniffing loudly, his nose pressing hard against her collarbone, right over her pulse. He whined again, shifting his weight. He smelled the stress on her. Dogs like Havoc, bred and trained for explosive ordnance detection and high-stress combat, could read human biochemistry better than any machine. He could smell the cortisol flooding her system, the elevated heart rate, the sour, cold sweat of impending death. "It's okay, buddy," Riley whispered, rocking him slightly. Her chains clinked. Havoc flinched at the sound, his ears pinning back momentarily before he leaned into her again. "I'm okay. I'm right here." She remembered a night in a mud brick compound outside Kabul. They had been pinned down for 6 hours. The air was thick with cordite and the copper smell of blood. Havoc had lay across her legs the entire time, utterly silent, his steady breathing the only thing keeping her tethered to reality while the world exploded outside. He was her tether now, but the tether was about to be cut. "5 minutes, Gallagher," the guard by the door said, checking his watch. Riley squeezed her eyes shut. She dragged her thumbs across Havoc's cheekbones, feeling the familiar bumps of his vibrishy, the stiff whiskers. She wanted to memorize the texture. She wanted this to be the last thing her brain processed before the chemicals stopped her heart. But as she pulled back slightly to look at his face, she noticed something was wrong. Havoc had stopped licking her. His ears, previously pinned back in submission and affection, suddenly snapped to sharp attention. The ridge of hair along his spine lifted. He wasn't looking at her anymore. He was looking over her shoulder, at the 2 guards by the door. Riley froze. She knew that posture. It was the exact stance Havoc took right before he indicated an improvised explosive device. His body went rigid, transforming from a pet-seeking comfort back into a tightly wound spring of a military asset. A heavy, deliberate pant started in his chest. Ha, ha, ha. Fast, shallow breaths. "Havoc," she whispered, a command tone bleeding into her voice without her meaning to. He ignored her. He pulled back from her embrace, stepped in front of her kneeling body, and sat down squarely between her and the guards. It was a defensive block. Riley's breath caught. She glanced at Jensen. The handler was standing near the metal table, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. On the surface, he looked like a soldier standing at parade rest. But Riley spent a decade reading body language in life-or-death situations. Jensen's jaw muscles were jumping. His eyes weren't locked on Havoc. They were tracking the placement of the cameras in the upper corners of the room. He was sweating. Havoc nudged Riley's chained hands with a hard, violent thrust of his nose. It wasn't a gentle request for a pet. It was a tactical nudge. Riley lowered her gaze. Havoc was pressing his side against her wrists. He wore a standard tactical harness, heavy nylon webbing with a handle on the back. It was identical to the one he wore on deployments, designed to allow a handler to lift him over walls or fast rope out of helicopters. Havoc nudged her again, harder, almost bruising her wrist bone against the steel cuff. He shoved his shoulder directly into her palms. "Feel." Riley kept her head down, acting like she was just burying her face in his side again. Her heavy chained hands rested against his ribs. She slid her fingers subtly under the thick nylon chest strap of the harness. Her index finger brushed against something hard. It wasn't part of the buckle. It was flat, rigid, and taped directly to the inside of the webbing where no casual inspection would find it, nestled deep in the thick fur of his chest. Riley's pulse skyrocketed. She didn't move her hand. She kept her fingers resting against the hidden object, mapping its shape through the layer of electrical tape. It was about 3 inches long, narrow, jagged on one side, a ceramic shim, non-metallic, designed to defeat the internal ratchets of maximum security handcuffs. Right next to it, a small hard square. A micro SIM card? No, it felt like a folded piece of heavy paper or plastic. Riley didn't pull the items out. She couldn't, not with the cameras watching. But her mind raced. The cynicism that had cloaked her for the past 18 months cracked, letting in a blinding, terrifying ray of adrenaline. This wasn't a PR stunt. The Pentagon didn't grant this visitation. Jensen forged the orders. She looked up at Jensen again, keeping her chin resting on Havoc's neck. Jensen met her eyes. He didn't nod. He didn't blink. He just subtly shifted his weight. "He's getting agitated," the guard by the door said, stepping forward, his hand resting casually on his utility belt. "Step away from the dog, inmate." "He's just excited," Jensen said smoothly, his voice echoing in the stark room. "He hasn't seen his original handler in over a year. Give him a second." "Rules say if the dog acts up, the visit is over," the guard insisted, taking another step. Havoc let out a low, vibrating growl. It didn't come from his throat. It started deep in his chest, a rumble that Riley could feel against her forearms. He bared his teeth, just a fraction, a flash of white ivory. "Havoc, 9!" Jensen commanded sharply, using the German training word. Havoc immediately stopped growling, but he didn't move. He maintained his block between Riley and the guard. Riley knew she had seconds. She had to secure the package. She let out another sob, faking a breakdown. She slumped heavily onto Havoc, driving her weight down, forcing both her and the dog closer to the floor. Under the guise of a desperate hug, her fingers worked frantically beneath the harness. Her fingernails, chipped and weak, dug into the edge of the electrical tape. It was strong tape. She couldn't peel it. Panic flared. She needed leverage. She shifted her wrist, hooking the edge of the handcuff metal against the tape. She scraped hard. The tape tore. The flat ceramic shim and the small plastic square dropped into her right palm. She immediately closed her fist, curling her fingers tight, hiding the objects against the skin of her palm beneath the heavy steel chain. "All right, that's enough," the guard barked. He sounded nervous now. The dog was too big, the situation too unpredictable. "Visit's over. Get the dog out of here, Sergeant." "Yes, sir," Jensen said. He stepped forward. "Havoc, higher." Havoc hesitated. He looked back at Riley. For a fleeting second, the tactical, aggressive posture melted, and he was just her dog again. He whined, licking her cheek one last time. A quick swipe of a rough tongue. "Go," Riley whispered, her voice barely audible. "Go on, buddy." Havoc turned and trotted back to Jensen, sitting firmly at his side. "Stand up, inmate," the guard ordered. Riley stood. Her legs felt weak, but the cold metal in her right palm burned like a live wire. She kept her hands clutched together in front of her stomach, perfectly concealing the items within the bundle of her own fingers and chains. "Face the wall," the guard said, approaching with a key to reattach the tether to her waist chain. As she turned, Riley caught Jensen's eye one final time. He was already leading Havoc toward the door, Just before he stepped out, Jensen paused, looking back over his shoulder. "Midnight, Riley," Jensen said, his voice carrying clearly across the room. The guard looked up, frowning. "What did you say?" Jensen didn't look at the guard. He looked straight at Riley. "I said it's a midnight execution. Make your peace." He turned and walked out, the heavy oak door swinging shut behind him. The guard scoffed. "Cold son of a bitch." He grabbed Riley's shoulder, spinning her toward the door. "Let's go. Back to the block." Riley started the slow, agonizing walk back. Shh, clack, step. Shh, clack, step. But the rhythm felt different now. The air in the prison didn't smell like bleach and floor wax anymore. It smelled like the possibility of violence. She rolled the ceramic shim between her thumb and forefinger inside her closed fist. It was cold. It was sharp. Midnight. Jensen hadn't just said it to be cruel. He had confirmed the timeline. Riley looked at the digital clock mounted above the security desk as they passed. 17:15. 6 hours and 45 minutes. She wasn't going to die tonight. No, she was going to war. The walk back to the cell block took exactly 4 minutes and 20 seconds. Riley counted the steps. 314 shuffles of her heavy canvas shoes against the polished linoleum. With every step, the ceramic shim and the flat plastic square burned against her palm, concealed by the rigid bend of her fingers and the heavy steel links of her belly chain. The air in the corridor felt thicker now, heavier in her lungs. She kept her head bowed, letting the greasy strands of her unwashed hair fall forward to hide the rapid darting of her eyes as she mapped the security cameras. They reached cell 4B. The guard, a heavy-set man named Hayes who always smelled faintly of sour milk and chewing tobacco, shoved her roughly inside. She stumbled, catching her balance just before her knees hit the concrete. "Strip search," Hayes grunted, pulling a pair of blue nitrile gloves from his belt pouch with a sharp snap. "Routine post-visitation protocol." Riley's stomach turned to ice. She knew the protocol, but the reality of it right now was a death sentence. She couldn't hide the shim in her hand during a cavity search. She had 3 seconds to make a decision. She coughed, a harsh hacking sound, bringing her chained hands up to cover her mouth. In one fluid, desperate motion, she pushed the flat plastic square and the sharp ceramic shim past her lips, tucking them deep into the fleshy pocket between her lower gum and her cheek. The edges of the ceramic immediately bit into the soft tissue of her mouth. She tasted the sharp, bright flavor of copper. Blood. "Hands on the wall," Hayes ordered. Riley complied, turning her back. She went through the humiliating motions of the search with absolute robotic detachment, forcing her facial muscles to remain slack despite the agonizing sting in her mouth. She breathed entirely through her nose, terrified that a sharp exhale would dislodge the rigid plastic square and send it clattering onto the floor. The metallic taste of her own blood grew stronger, sliding down the back of her throat, coating it in a thick, nauseating slick. "All right, dress," Hayes muttered, stripping off the gloves and tossing them into a biohazard bin outside the cell. "Locking down." The heavy steel door slammed shut. The deadbolt engaged with its familiar skull-rattling clack. Riley waited 30 seconds, listening to Hayes's heavy footsteps recede down the tier, until the metal security door at the end of the block hissed shut. Only then did she step over to the stainless steel toilet bowl and spit the items into her palm. Her saliva was stained a deep, rusty pink. She wiped the ceramic shim and the plastic square on the rough fabric of her orange jumpsuit, panting softly in the gloom. It was 1800 hours. The execution was scheduled for midnight. She had 6 hours, but she couldn't move yet. She had to wait for the final shift change at 2300 when the guards were tired, distracted by the turnover paperwork and looking at the clock. She sat on the edge of the steel cot. The 60 hertz hum of the fluorescent tube seemed louder now, drilling into her temples. The cell was freezing, but a cold, clammy sweat broke out across her shoulders. Her body knew what was coming. The adrenaline was already starting to pool in her system, making her hands shake and her vision tunnel slightly. She closed her eyes and focused on the smell of her own skin. Stale sweat, cheap lye soap, and the lingering, ghostly scent of Fritos and desert dust from Havoc's fur. It grounded her. At 2200 hours, the overhead lights cut out with a loud thump, replaced by the dim, sickly yellow glow of the night lights. Riley moved. She slid off the cot and sat flat on the cold concrete floor, bringing her knees up to her chest. She started with the leg irons. The chain was heavy, restricting her reach, but the locking mechanism was a standard Smith & Wesson double lock. She gripped the tiny ceramic shim between her thumb and forefinger. It was barely the size of a matchstick, incredibly difficult to manipulate with hands that had gone soft from 18 months of confinement. She pressed the flat edge of the shim into the keyway of the right ankle cuff. She couldn't see what she was doing. She had to rely entirely on the tactile feedback echoing up through the ceramic. Feel the pins. She probed the inside of the lock, her bruised thumb aching as she applied pressure. The shim slipped. The sharp, jagged edge sliced directly into her cuticle. Riley gasped, a sharp intake of air through her teeth. But she didn't stop. Warm blood welled up, making her fingers slick, making the ceramic harder to hold. She wiped her hand ruthlessly on her pants, gripped the shim again, and dug back into the lock. Push, twist, catch the ratchet. It took 45 minutes of agonizing, microscopic adjustments. Her back cramped, a vicious spasm tearing through her lumbar spine. She ignored it. Finally, she felt the internal catch give way. A soft, metallic snick echoed in the quiet cell. The right ankle cuff popped open. She exhaled a breath she felt she had been holding for an hour. She quickly repeated the process on the left ankle. This one went faster. 15 minutes. The heavy chain hit the concrete with a dull thud. Her legs were free. Now, the belly chain and the handcuffs. This was the problem. The cuffs were connected to a heavy padlock at her waist, severely limiting her arm mobility. She couldn't reach the keyways on her own wrists with the necessary angle to apply torque. She stared at the steel padlock resting against her stomach. She needed to pick the cuffs first. To do that, she had to dislocate her own thumb. It wasn't a clean, cinematic trick. It was brutal, raw biology. Riley wedged her right thumb against the heavy steel link of the belly chain. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the smell of chalk dust and concrete, and shoved her hand forward with violently applied body weight. The joint popped with a sickening wet crunch. Bile surged into the back of Riley's throat. Her vision went completely white for 3 seconds. A ragged animal sound tore out of her lips, but she buried her face in her knees to muffle it. The pain was blinding, a hot spike driven directly into her wrist. Her right thumb now hung at a grotesque, unnatural angle. But it gave her the clearance she needed. Panting heavily, sweat pouring down her face and stinging her eyes, she gripped the bloody ceramic shim with her left hand. She contorted her broken right hand, sliding it backward through the steel bracelet just enough to expose the keyway to her left fingers. Click. The right cuff opened. Riley slumped against the cinder block wall, clutching her throbbing hand to her chest. She used her left hand to manually grab her dislocated right thumb and snap the joint back into the socket. Another wave of nauseating pain hit her, followed by a rush of heat as blood flow returned to the crushed tissue. She lay there on the cold floor for 10 minutes, just breathing, letting the nausea pass. It was 23:15. She was behind schedule. She quickly picked the left cuff and let the heavy belly chain fall away. She stood up. Her legs were shaky, her joints popping loudly in the silence. She walked over to the cell door. The locking mechanism wasn't purely mechanical. It was an electronic deadbolt backed up by a central server. That was what the plastic square was for. Riley examined it in the dim yellow light. It was a cloned RFID bypass card, stripped of its plastic casing to make it flexible and easily concealable. The circuitry was entirely exposed. She slid the thin card into the narrow gap between the heavy steel door and the frame, right where the magnetic reader sat embedded in the wall. Nothing happened. Panic, cold and sharp, flared in her chest. She adjusted the card, sliding it up a fraction of an inch. She held her breath. A tiny green LED on the card flickered. The heavy deadbolt retracted with a heavy pneumatic thunk. Riley didn't push the door immediately. She pressed her ear against the cold steel, listening. The tier was silent. The night guard, a junior corrections officer named Collins, should be at the desk at the far end of the block, watching the monitors. She eased the door open. The hinges were well oiled. They didn't squeak. The air in the corridor hit her. Colder, smelling heavily of bleach and industrial floor wax. She stepped out in her bare feet, having abandoned the canvas slip-ons in the cell to eliminate the sound of her footsteps. She moved down the tier, hugging the wall, staying in the darkest shadows cast by the recessed lighting. Her right hand throbbed in time with her heartbeat, swollen and dark with bruising. She kept it loose at her side, ready to strike. She reached the end of the block. The security desk was enclosed in a cage of reinforced glass. Collins was sitting inside. He wasn't looking at the monitors. He was looking down at a crossword puzzle. A styrofoam cup of coffee steaming at his elbow. Riley needed the primary keycard clipped to his belt to open the exterior blast doors. She couldn't sneak past him. She had to go through him. Riley stepped out of the shadows and approached the mesh door of the security cage. It was propped open with a rubber wedge, a lazy violation of protocol that Collins likely committed every night to let the heat from the desk lamp circulate. She didn't hesitate. She stepped into the cage. Collins looked up, his brain taking a full second to process the sight of a death row inmate standing 3 feet away in bare feet. He opened his mouth to shout, his hand dropping toward the panic button on his radio. Riley lunged. It wasn't a clean, tactical strike. She was malnourished, dehydrated, and operating on sheer adrenaline. She threw her entire body weight at him, her injured right hand grabbing the front of his uniform shirt, while her left forearm smashed into his throat. They went over backward in the rolling desk chair. The chair wheels snagged on the linoleum, and they crashed to the floor in a tangle of limbs. The styrofoam cup exploded, showering them both in scalding coffee. Collins thrashed violently. He was a big man, heavily muscled, and panic gave him frantic strength. He drove a heavy elbow into Riley's ribs. She felt something crack, the pain stealing her breath instantly. He bucked, trying to throw her off, his hand scrabbling for the radio on his belt. Riley clamped her left arm tighter around his neck, sinking her weight into the chokehold. She buried her face in his shoulder to avoid his flailing fists. Collins clawed at her arm, his thick fingernails digging into her skin. tearing long bloody scratches down her forearm. He was gasping, a horrible, wet, choking sound, the smell of stale coffee and panic sweat radiating off him. He managed to rip the radio from his belt. He brought it up, ready to smash the heavy plastic antenna into Riley's skull. Riley let go of his shirt with her throbbing right hand. Ignoring the screaming pain in her swollen thumb, she grabbed his wrist, pinning the radio to the floor. She shifted her hips, locking her legs around his waist, cutting off his leverage. She squeezed his throat with everything she had left. The fight was suffocating, desperate, and completely silent, save for the squeak of rubber soles on linoleum and the harsh wet rasp of Collins fighting for air. 30 seconds, 40 seconds. Collins' movements began to slow. The furious thrashing turned into sluggish, uncoordinated jerks. His grip on Riley's arm loosened. 10 seconds later, his body went completely limp, his eyes rolling back in his head. Riley didn't let go immediately. She held the choke for another 5 seconds, ensuring he was deeply unconscious, not just playing possum. Then she released him, rolling off his heavy chest and collapsing onto the floor beside him. She lay there in the puddle of spilled coffee, gasping for air, her lungs burning, her ribs screaming in protest. She wiped the sweat from her eyes, her hand coming away smeared with blood from the scratches on her arm. She forced herself to sit up. Her hands were shaking violently now, the adrenaline crash threatening to pull her under. She stripped the master key card from Collins' belt clip and grabbed his radio, turning the volume dial down to a faint whisper. She looked at the digital clock on the security console. 23:42, 18 minutes until they came to her cell to prep her for the lethal injection. Riley gripped the key card, tasting the iron in her mouth again. The hardest part was over. Now, she just had to vanish. The service corridors behind the main cell block smelled entirely different from the rest of the prison. Here, the sterile scent of bleach faded, replaced by the dry, ancient smell of concrete dust, hot electrical wires, and the faint, unmistakable odor of rat droppings. Riley moved through the maintenance tunnels like a ghost. Her bare feet left damp prints on the dusty concrete, a trail of sweat and spilled coffee. She kept one hand pressed against her broken ribs, her breathing shallow and measured to manage the sharp, stabbing pain with every inhale. The master key card from Collins worked on the heavy, unmarked fire doors. She swiped it at the final threshold, a reinforced steel barrier that led to the prison's loading dock. The magnetic lock disengaged with a dull click. She pushed the door open and stepped into the cool night air. The loading dock was bathed in the harsh sodium-orange glow of the security lamps. It was raining, a fine misty drizzle that immediately chilled the sweat on Riley's skin. The sheer expanse of the open sky above her felt disorienting, almost terrifying after 18 months of confined geometry. Parked in the shadows between two massive commercial dumpsters was a dark blue, unmarked cargo van. The engine was off, but Riley could hear the faint, rhythmic ticking of the exhaust manifold cooling down. She limped toward it, her muscles finally beginning to stiffen from the fight with Collins. The side door of the van slid open with a soft rumble. Jensen stood in the doorway. He was out of uniform, wearing dark jeans, a black windbreaker, and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He didn't smile. The deep lines around his mouth looked even harsher in the orange light. "You're late," Jensen whispered, extending a hand down to her. "Traffic," Riley rasped. Her voice sounded like crushed gravel. She reached up, grabbing his forearm. Jensen hauled her into the back of the van with a single powerful pull. As soon as her feet hit the rubber matting of the floorboards, a massive weight slammed into her chest. Havoc. He didn't bark. He knew the protocol for a stealth extraction, but he hit her with the force of an artillery shell, his heavy paws planting squarely on her shoulders, his nose pressing frantically into her neck. He was whining, a continuous, high-pitched vibration of pure anxiety and relief. Riley fell backward onto the metal bench seat, wrapping her arms tightly around his thick neck. She buried her face in his damp fur, breathing in the smell of wet wool and corn chips. The pain in her ribs, her throbbing hand, the bleeding cuts on her arm. It all washed away under the sheer, radiating heat of the dog. "Good boy," she mumbled into his collar, her voice breaking. "I got it, buddy. We're good." Havoc licked the blood off her chin, his rough tongue scraping against her bruised skin, his heavy tail thumping a frantic, muffled beat against the side panel of the van. Jensen slid the door shut, plunging them into absolute darkness. He climbed into the driver's seat and turned the key. The van's engine roared to life, a deep, anonymous rumble. He didn't turn on the headlights. "They'll notice Collins is down in about 10 minutes, Jensen said, his voice drifting back to her over the engine noise. "The cell check is in 12. By the time they lock down the perimeter, we'll be through the secondary gate." "Where are we going?" Riley asked, keeping her face pressed against Havoc's side. "Away," Jensen replied simply. He dropped the van into drive and eased off the brake. "Your file was deleted from the secure servers 20 minutes ago. The cameras in the visitation room looped over your meeting. As far as the bureaucratic machinery of the United States military is concerned, inmate 4098 ceased to exist at midnight." Riley closed her eyes. The van bumped over a speed bump, the suspension groaning. She felt the exact moment they passed through the final security gate, the tires transitioning from the smooth asphalt of the prison compound to the rough, broken macadam of the county highway. She had survived, but the realization settled heavily in her gut. She was dead. The woman who had earned the trident, the operator who had bled in the sand for a country that ultimately tried to strap her to a gurney. She was gone. There would be no vindication, no medals, no clearing her name. She would live the rest of her life in the shadows, a ghost haunting the edges of the world. She tightened her grip on Havoc's harness. The thick nylon felt rough and real beneath her bleeding fingers. Havoc let out a long, shuddering sigh and settled his massive head onto her lap, his body completely relaxing for the first time since he walked into the visitation room. His breathing slowed, syncing with the rhythm of the rolling tires. Riley leaned her head back against the cold metal wall of the van. She didn't feel heroic. She felt battered, exhausted, and utterly hollowed out. But as she listened to the steady, rhythmic heartbeat of the dog resting against her legs, the hollow space inside her began to fill with something quiet and fierce. She looked out the small, barred window of the van. The rain was picking up, blurring the orange street lights into streaks of fire as they sped into the absolute black of the night. They were gone. If Riley's story left your heart pounding, do not let it end here. Hit that like button to show your support for this incredible journey. Subscribe to our channel and ring the bell so you never miss another intense, emotionally grounded story. Share this video with a friend who appreciates raw, real narratives about loyalty, survival, and the unbreakable bond between a soldier and her K9. Your support helps us bring more gripping stories to life. Thank you for watching.